Okay, then let's do it. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our April 2020 Albany Pine Bush Science Lecture. I'm Richard Naylor from the Friends of the Pine Bush community, and we co-sponsor with Commission staff our monthly science lecture. Before we start today's program, Litter to Glitter, Unlocking the Herbaceous Potential Stored in Forest Floors, I have a note about questions for our speaker and a description of next month's program. First, as questions occurred to you during today's presentation, and we hope they do, we love questions, we suggest that you use the Q&A option at the bottom of the screen to type your question. Dylan will direct your questions to our speaker at the end, but please add them whenever you think of them. Second, our May 20th, 7 p.m. science lecture will be Ants of Inland Massachusetts Barrens. Barrens are rare and imperiled natural communities. In Massachusetts, active management is helping to restore and maintain these biodiverse habitats. The talk by Antioch University graduate student Kyle Bradford will give an overview of different barrens communities of inland Massachusetts and discuss ant fauna with special attention to rare species and those with fascinating natural history. Additionally, there will be discussion of how both management and environmental factors affect ant diversity and abundance in these barrens. So that's next month, but now on to Dylan to introduce today's speaker. Dylan.
Thank you so much, Richard. And thank you everyone so much for joining us this evening. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Andrew Vander Yacht. So Dr. Vander Yacht is coming to us from Michigan, where he lives with his wife and his 2-year-old twin girls, who he lovingly refers to as terrorists. I think, and we said that's what happens when you have twins, 2-year-olds. They're not just, it's not just the terrible twos, it's the terrorist twos. But he was in Michigan for his Bachelor's of Science degree in biology at Hope College. And then he went down to Tennessee, the University of Tennessee, where he got his Master's of Science degree in wildlife science. And then he stayed there to complete his PhD. His dissertation work was looking at fire ecology and management at the Center for Native Grasslands Management. And he's since moved back to Michigan. He's currently at Michigan State University in the forestry department. He's an academic research specialist there, and he teaches classes and specializes in forest ecology and management. So thank you so much for rescheduling with us tonight, and very much looking forward to your talk.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much, Amanda. And I really apologize for, having to reschedule this. It was a terrible stomach bug that I had, but no worries. And hopefully everyone made the adjustment well. And yeah, with that, I'd love to jump into my talk here. Litter to Glitter, Unlocking the Herbaceous Potential Stored in Forest Floors. And again, this was a part of my dissertation. So one chapter within the work that I did during my PhD at the University of Tennessee. Let's go. There we go. So to start off and kick this off, definitely there is a lot of people and groups that need to be acknowledged. This was not something that could have been accomplished just by myself. So to proceed right into it and for me to get all the glory from everything that I present would be dishonest. First of all, I'd like to thank my major advisors at the University of Tennessee, Dr. Pat Kaiser and Dr. Charles Quitt. As well as some master's students who also laid the groundwork for some of the stuff that we'll be presenting today. Seth Barrios, Max Cox, and Chrissy Henderson. Great people there. And then the funding. What can we do without money? So principally that included the Joint Fire Science Program, which if you are not aware of, I would highly encourage you to look up and check out. They are always on the federal funding chopping block. And so I think it's just a great program that really organizes regionally fire science communication between academics and managers. And then also the National Wild Turkey Federation, which actually funded my master's and the early portions of the data collection within this project. And then all of our site partners, my committee members, the 28 total technicians that collected all of this data, my family, my friends, and then Michigan State University Department of Forestry, which currently pays me and so has contributed in a way to this presentation. So where are we headed today? Everything that we're going to talk about is actually presented here within this work that I published in the Journal of Fire Ecology under the title Litter to Glitter, Promoting Herbaceous Ground Cover and Diversity in Mid-Southern USA Oak Forests Using Canopy Disturbance and Fire. So the results of that paper are what we're going to focus on and then give you a little context and some additional snippets from some other research that I've been involved in. Specifically, it's going to include covering some historical context, getting into the modern effects of mesophication. It's a big word, but we'll work our way through it. And then getting into restoration response, and finally kind of wrapping it all up and pulling it together with some synthesis and conclusions. So to pictorially represent where we're going, basically this image here represents the typical understory of forests as they exist today. Apply a little management with some thinning and some fire, and you can turn that understory into something that looks a little bit more like this. I think that is pretty incredible. So again, to illustrate, this is just our typical forest settings here in the Eastern United States. This is what we typically have. Again, apply a little management, and voila, we get something that looks very, very different and that you can recognize as pretty unique. Something that you can't really see, just on any old woodland or just any forested parcel that you go into. This is something that you would recognize as special. So again, this is what the understory of much of our eastern forests look like. Apply a little management like we did in the studies that I'm going to present today, and you get something that is truly spectacular in terms of results. And so we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about that first image. We're going to talk about how we got there. We're going to talk about the second image, how we got there. And then we're also going to talk about what those are in relation to each other in a historical context. So litter to glitter, explained in pictures there, and that's where we'll be headed. So to begin, and so one more image of that process. Apply a little management, and bam, we get something very, very different. Diversity of forbs, grasses in the understory, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So I'd like to start by asking everyone to close their eyes and imagine with me that you are on a journey. You've arrived in that first wave of settlers to the North American continent. You're coming from, likely from Europe. You've arrived in a boat, and you're going to try to make it as that first kind of wave of settlement in the new world. We arrive to a place we're, probably getting to the frontier as it was then, which was probably the crest of the Appalachian Mountains. So imagine you're standing on one of those mountains and you're looking out across the landscape. I want you to imagine what you see. What is it that spreads out in front of you? So with your eyes closed, you can now open your eyes. I would venture to guess that this is what most of you had pictured in your mind, or what most typical people who maybe are not turning into the Albany Pine Bush webinars imagine. And this is this pristine myth that America in 1492 was a closed canopy forest that stretched from the eastern coast to the Mississippi River, that a squirrel could jump from tree to tree to tree that entire distance and span that entire distance. And I'm here to tell you that that is just certainly not the case. Fire has been influencing ecological communities in this region or in the world for 500 million years, since the Silurian. And we know this from a variety of lines of evidence. We can look at cores and depositional environments that provide us indications of what pollen and thus the plant communities would have looked like way back in time. We can also look at charcoal in those cores and kind of understand the relative frequency at which charcoal deposits occur, and get some kind of sense of fire's frequency. We can also look at tree rings. So trees annually put on a ring's worth of growth. And when fire comes, it can locally damage the growing tissue and create a scar that then subsequent rings start to grow around and permanently seal in that record of that fire that occurs. And so if we stack all those up, we can get some kind of indication across the landscape of how often fires were occurring. And then we just know from the very early descriptions of these landscapes when settlers arrived, what they may have looked like. Combine all of that together and we can get some really cool reviews. This one here, Lafon et al. 2017 is a really good one that kind of goes through all of that evidence and compiles it for the Appalachian region, which I think you'll find very interesting. And when we combine all of that, we can get some kind of sense at how frequently fire occurred across the landscape. And so here's one example of that, using a variety of parameters that shows, across the eastern United States, fire was regionally pretty frequent in various spots. And so you can, see that, these mean fire return intervals. So basically when fire was reoccurring across the landscape, from less than every other year to all the way upwards of 200 to 6,000 years. Every 200 to 6,000 years an area was burning. And so you can see those color coded there. But that is kind of all of the evidence that kind of stacks up related to the specific evidence of fire and disturbance across forested landscapes of the eastern United States. But I really like to dive into what I feel is greater evidence, and that is the wildlife and plant life, the species that actually inhabited the eastern United States historically. So many people don't know that historically bison and elk were very frequent across the eastern United States. This matters in this context because both bison and elk are obligate graminivores. They eat grass, and grass doesn't grow as abundantly in a closed canopy, dark, wet forest as it does in a more open savanna to grassland-like environment. So the fact that these animals ranged in the eastern United States suggests that there was something a little different than maybe what we have today. Also, greater prairie chickens, which as their name suggests were grassland birds, were so abundant in Kentucky that no good hunter deigned to shoot them, as John James Audubon was quoted in saying. So they were a trash bird. They were so common, and now they're largely extirpated east of the Mississippi River. Also, when we look at plants, so here I am in as a forester in forestry. I like to focus in on our trees. So we have our longleaf pines, and I'm sure a lot of people are aware of the grass stage that longleaf pine has and how that compacts needles around that apical meristem so that when fires happen, it protects that growing part of the tree until one day they've reached enough below ground resources that they can rocket up and really get up above the fire regime. So that grass stage is really important. But also further north, we have shortleaf pine, and shortleaf pine has a really cool, unique J-shaped basal crook, which allows a bunch of meristematic tissue, so the actively growing parts of a plant that can form new tissues right below the soil surface. So all along that parallel part that's traveling right below the soil surface, you can re-sprout from. So this is a pine tree that actually, when it's top killed by fire, can rapidly re-sprout, and that makes it pretty unique, and it's an adaptation to fire. And then we could go even further north, where most of our forests are dominated by oaks, and talk about things like, why do oaks germinate and do so from below ground, hypogeal germination? Why do they devote more resources to root growth versus shoot growth? They're putting a whole bunch of resources below ground, safely tucked away from fire. Why do they have such thick bark? Why are they so good at resprouting? Why are they so good at compartmentalizing wounds that might occur from fire? all of this, I think, speaks to the history of fire across this landscape. And then if we look a little bit more broadly at these herbaceous layers that once occurred. So we know something about in longleaf savannas, we have some of the highest small scale diversity observed anywhere on the planet, greater than 50 species per meter squared in the understory of these systems. And that was largely maintained by fire. And so oak savannas, which are a little bit further north, get a little bit more moisture, would have rapidly succeeded as soon as we put out those fires. We don't know that information about, but where we did have some remnant communities, more out in like Wisconsin and Minnesota and those types of things where we made these types of observations, oak savannas were certainly, the understory in those plant communities was certainly more diverse than either prairies or forests because they had these transitional natures, and that makes them really cool and a product of fire, that understory disturbance. And then finally, to get what I think is the greatest evidence is when you combine all those plant and species and then the evidence of fire into the pre-European settlement extent and distribution of fire-dependent communities. And so most of the time people present this as this transitional zone between the prairies of the West and the eastern deciduous forests. So you see that here, we've got tall grass prairie bleeding into tall grass savanna. But this is certainly underestimating the extent of these fire-dependent communities because we know, for instance, the longleaf pine savannas would have dominated the coastal plain. We would have had eastern woodlands and savannas and evidence of that throughout the Piedmont and Tennessee valleys, the Ohio Valley, and certainly other places. We have Appalachian mountain balds, which are maintained through a series of disturbances related to herbivores and fire in the Appalachian Mountains. And then jack pine barrens even further north, and certainly some pine barrens that would have occurred in the Albany Pine Bush as well. So all of that pokes these giant holes into that myth that you or perhaps of others believe about the eastern United States. And then also, it's these really cool quotes here. So one of my study sites is located just about right where this black dot is for this quote that talks about luxuriant growth of native grasses pastured over as far as the eye could see with numerous herds of deer, elk, and buffalo. And I assure you that this region of Tennessee looks nothing like that today. It is a closed canopy, dark forest over much of that Cumberland Plateau. And then a little closer to home, here where I'm at here in Michigan now, a quote here from 1837, there was no underbrush, flowers covered the earth and yielded a fragrant perfume. So pretty cool to think about that. And I think really what all of this does is flip on its head people's perspective of where fires occur. So if we look at these color-coded maps here, the lower map is depicting precipitation. So the hotter colors are lower amounts of precipitation. But I would suspect that many people think of that map as representative of fire regimes. So the hotter areas being where more fires occur. The fire is a Western phenomenon, right? All of these wildfires that are Western. When in actuality, fire was very frequent here in the eastern United States, at least historically, and is actually the inverse of these trends in precipitation. And so that argues for how important it was in inserting diversity. So in an area where that would otherwise become closed canopy forest, fire was the force that was inserting woodlands, savannas, and making succession skip backwards and maintaining earlier successional community types. And then that last circle here is just depicting that today. This is where I'll be focusing in my attention. My study sites span Tennessee, Kentucky, and eastern North Carolina, or western North Carolina. And so most of the stuff I'll be talking about today is related to that, but hopefully you can find some links to the Albany Pine Bush. All right, so what is it about this greatest evidence, oak woodlands and savannas, that make them unique? Well, we have to start with sparse overstories. So when I talk about a woodland, I'm saying 30 to 80% canopy cover. So trees that are sparser than a closed canopy forest, around 30 to 80% canopy cover. When I talk about savannas, I'm talking about 10 to 30%, so much lower. The African savannas that maybe some of you instantly draw upon is a good example. So there's that, the overstories. There's also an absent and reduced mid-story, and this is because frequent fires will keep that woody regeneration at bay. It continually sets it back, and so oftentimes the understory is dominated by a robust herbaceous layer. So these are native warm season grasses, many legumes, and other forbs, so wildflowers and grasses. And the diversity here is greater than forests and prairies because you have all of these transitional environments. You have a very transitional environment. You have areas that are wide open, and then you also have the areas that are very close to the understories of trees that are dark and wet and more reminiscent of a forest. So all those conditions are all in the same area, and that makes it presents the right ingredients to breed diversity. Now, I'm going to go through, so those are the three characteristics of oak woodlands and savannas that I want you to focus on. And I am going to go through kind of a complex reasoning that will lead us back to why this herbaceous layer is so important to understand, and why looking at the results I'm going to look at focusing on today is so important. So fire has direct effects on all three of these characteristics, right? Fire can kill overstory trees. Fire reduces that mid-story, keeps those woody plants at bay, and it also directly enhances the germination and growth of herbaceous layers by limiting, so direct effects on herbaceous layers. Now, there are some also indirect effects in that when fire alters the overstory, it's sliding us down this gradient in terms of canopy cover by effects on overstory trees, or at least preventing a lot of overstory trees from growing up within these areas. And then it also directly affects that reduced mid-story. Where their fire was infrequent, you had a very thick mid-story. Where you had more frequent fires, a much less dense mid-story. And a lot of work in oak savannas and woodlands has determined that these two gradients here, the way in which fire affects the mid-story and the way in which fire affects the overstory, result in fires per decade and then reductions in canopy cover results in a peak in diversity at intermediate levels of canopy cover and maximum levels of fires per decade. So you get those effects going on. And so this is all about plant resource gradients. So as you radiate outward from the bole of an overstory tree, you get more and more light, you get less moisture, you have changes in nutrients in the soil. And then that same types of plant resource gradients are going on as you change the mid-story density of vegetation. And so that's leading directly into the diversity and robustness of that herbaceous layer through that pathway. But I also want to bring up the fact that our robust herbaceous layers, when we create them, are influencing community flammability. So when we have this closed, wet forest environment, flammability is much less than when we have this open, herbaceously dominated, drier environment where flammability is much greater. So in a way, this herbaceous development is then influencing fire in these areas. And so the point I want to make through all of this is that these systems are often classified or described as fire dependent, but we can ultimately say that they're herbaceous layer dependent because it's the herbaceous layer that's really directing the flammability and the intensity of those fire effects within the system. And so I think that's a really cool thing to point out. All right, so if that was the end of the story, we could call up David Attenborough and get an episode of Planet Earth rolling and, just kind of describe all that. But sadly, that is not the end. We enter this phenomenon that we call mesophication. So Basically, mesophication is a series of changes in these systems over a long period of time where things have gotten wetter, things have gotten darker, and all of those changes have favored plants that then have positive feedbacks and create even wetter and darker conditions into the future. And so this was described in a really good paper by Abrams and Nowacki in 2008 as basically a phenomenon that is occurring across the eastern United States. And principally, its cause is the decline in fire frequency. So here's a good image here of what we think, historical fire frequency might have been, and in the early arrival of settlers that may have increased and peaked as we were slashing and burning things. But then enters in our good friend Smokey the Bear, who told us all fire is bad and we need to put them all out. And we basically eliminated fire from our natural systems. But I want to argue that prior to the lines of evidence that we have really good in terms of what fire frequency was, it may have been actually even higher. And that is because Native Americans used fire for a variety of different reasons. And around the time that our fire frequency evidence tracks back to, Hernando de Soto in 1539 roamed all around the Southeast, and with it he brought diseases that would have decimated those Native American populations. So I think that that's a fair point to make and kind of qualifies this in terms of what has actually happened over time to fire frequency in the eastern United States. So when we think about mesophication, we think about we can attach a whole bunch of negative effects of this process. And so number one, I think that mesophication, we know that mesophication has done a lot in terms of affecting the regeneration of our forest tree species. And so here's a nice diagram here. And we see, and this is for Michigan, but it could equally apply for almost any state that you look at in the eastern United States, in that we have this trend of the larger size classes of trees. So this on the x-axis here is diameter. And so in the larger size classes, we have about an equal representation of oaks versus maples, oaks being fire tolerant, maples being fire sensitive. But when we go down to the lower size classes, the future of our forests, right, when regeneration grows up, that this is what's going to be replacing it, we have a dominance, 80 to 90% dominance of our fire sensitive species. And it doesn't take a forester to realize that if we fast forward those trends, our future forests are going to look very, very different. And we're going to have a wholesale flip in terms of the composition of those forests in the future. Secondly, this process has negatively affected disturbance dependent wildlife. So declines in these species are very evident. And we can look at that when we think about classical endangered species in the eastern United States. So the Kirtland's warbler or the Carner blue butterfly. These are species that are on the endangered species list for a reason, and that is because disturbance has declined. And when we look at birds in particular, we see forest birds have declined, sure, but nothing compared to the declines that we've seen in our grassland birds. And when we look at forest birds in particular, what we kind of see is this bimodal distribution in terms of there are some forest birds that are doing okay. There are some forest birds that are rapidly declining. And a poster child for that group, that second group, is the cerulean warbler. And cerulean warblers actually do better with a slightly tattered canopy of forest. So forests that have some small gaps in it and stuff, those would have been the environments you would have found on the edge of these more disturbance dependent community types like savannas and woodlands. And it speaks to the history of disturbance and the influence that it has on even our forest birds. So these birds that are dependent on a forest structure, but like it to be a little bit tattered. Then finally, thirdly, we've got this loss of herbaceous ground cover and diversity. So the exact opposite of all those pictures I showed to start off with, that what once was an understory of lush diversity of forbs and grasses has transitioned into nothing but leaf litter. And then finally, thinking about these communities as a whole, only 0.02% of oak savannas are left in the eastern United States, according to what we think was historically here. That is greater than a 99% decline, and it's about the same as if you would have had $1,000 and you're left with 2 dimes. And that is not a good investment in anyone's book. So the disappearance of eastern grasslands, woodlands, and savannas is something related to this phenomenon of mesophication. All right, so one little last thing here, of introductory material. I want to present to you some analysis that I've done for Tennessee in particular. So this is Tennessee prior to European settlement, according to land fire data, which is a really cool spatial data set that incorporates a whole bunch of different factors to try to guess at what once was across the United States prior to European settlement. This is the biophysical settings layer of that data set. And I have reduced all of the ecological communities that land fire describes into simply pyrophobic vegetation. So these are forests that would not have liked fire. Oak forests, pine forests, mixed oak and pine forests. And our oaks and pine species are largely fire tolerant and like it. And so you see that going on. And then, so let's fast forward. So this was prior to European settlement. And then the cool thing that this data set does is it also looks at successional state. So within any one of these cover types, so let's take oak forests, for example, you can look at this pie chart and see that, you know, around 2/3 of it would have been in woodland and savanna type successional state. Only, you know, maybe a sixth or something of it, this light green color would have actually been in closed canopy oak forest. So here we have some pie charts here on the successional state at which these communities would have existed prior to European settlement. Fast forward, this is today. So the first thing that we see is, sure, development has grown and swallowed up a chunk of these communities. Sure, we all know that. And so you see this black rolling out. But I also want to back up and now watch the colors within a particular community. So perhaps let's focus in on oaks and see that there's a lot of orange and a little bit of light green and a little bit of dark green. So the black has taken a chunk out of it, but that what has really happened is that orange has just vanished and a whole lot more forest has developed. And so when we put all that together and we actually run the statistics on all of those cells in these data set, what we see is that pyrophobic forests have declined by about 50%. We've developed them. They've gone away. But our pyrophilic forests, so our oak and pine forests, have actually almost doubled in terms of size. And you can actually see that here if we, you know, look at, if we look at the oak and I back up, we look at the oak pine, look at that oak pie chart and watch what happens to that light green color. It about doubles. And so we see that our oak forests are actually, you know, increased by about 97%. And, but what's really going on is woodlands and savannas are declined by 90%. Our shrublands have declined by about the same, and our grasslands have declined by about 99%. And that's pretty important to know. But if we recognize all of that, this cause, the decline in fire and disturbance across the eastern United States, really does present us with some hope, I think. Because basically what it suggests is that simply restoring some level of disturbance can do a lot to correct all of the things that have gone wrong in terms of what mesophication's negative effects. So really what we're talking about is, when we talk about restoring healthy oak ecosystems, is reversing mesophication. And specifically, the restoring this herbaceous layer is absolutely critically important in terms of its effects on woody species and its effects on wildlife and its effects on the community as a whole. Because that herbaceous layer is a foundational community component, a foundational habitat component, and a foundational fuel component, which affects the way in which fire behaves, which then in turn affects, woody tree dynamics and the composition of our forests. So with that, we can really think about restoration as involving two different things. The way in which we thin these forest systems, so altering the overstory structure and composition, increasing understory light, and instantly restoring those resource gradients by just doing a little thinning and restoring that historical savanna-like structure. And it also provides funding to fund that restoration work through the form of timber sales. However, heavy disturbance is a very rare and understudied phenomenon in the eastern forest. We just typically don't like it as kind of this back end of the environmental movement. We don't like to cut a lot of trees. And then also woody understory dominance. So if we release all of that woody growth and seedlings, we just instantly return to this jungle of understory woody dominance. So we've got to deal with that. And then also, are we just promoting weedy herbaceous species and not actually, this conservative herbaceous community and the diversity that once was held? And then we can talk about fire, and specifically fire seasonality. So fire ultimately limits woody competition, releases plant nutrients into the soil, and encourages germination. But it's very slow to alter the overstory, so we should probably pair it with some thinnings. And we believe that growing season fire, or burning in the growing season, might be more efficient in controlling the woody growth that occurs. And I'll explain that a little bit later. It also might translate into greater effects on the herbaceous layer, because if we have greater effects on the woody competition, then we might have greater increases in the herbaceous layer. It also represents it might also represent a departure from historical fire regimes, so it's worth studying. And so to illustrate why burning in the growing season might be of an advantage, we have to understand the cycle across 1 year. So on the x-axis here, we have months in root carbohydrates. So imagine you're a tree. In the spring, you leaf out and deplete all of your root reserves. And slowly those come, you're building those up in your leaves, and you're harvesting all of that energy from photosynthesis. And come fall, you translocate it all below ground so that you can respire throughout the winter and eventually leaf out again in the spring. So most of the time, our burning occurs here in the dormant season, March, April, that early part before leaf out, when below ground resources are actually the highest for woody species. And what we're suggesting is burning when below ground resources are lower. And what this would do, so in this study, we were burning in October consistently, is cut off those resources from making their way below ground and being stored for subsequent resprouting after a fire. And so ultimately maybe more efficient in terms of limiting that woody competition. And we need to understand that, this historical versus management objectives, is this historical? No, but does it accomplish a management objective? I think certainly. And in some places it might actually be historical fire season. And then also understanding that this might be the result of just differences in fire behavior. If you're burning consistently in one season versus the other, it might just be related to differences in fire behavior. And so the final component here that I think is important to point out is that there are a lack of regionally specific attempts to do this. A lot of our oak savanna and woodland restoration research comes out of the Midwest, where we have better remnants of those types of communities where succession did not proceed as rapidly and erase them from the landscape. And also some invasive species concerns. Whenever you just apply disturbance, you're likely to encounter that. So with that, let's get into the research. So our experimental design included 4 study sites scattered across the Mid-South, where we applied thinning. We thinned a little, our woodland treatments, or we thinned a lot, our savanna treatments. So 60 or 30 square feet per hectare, which is roughly about 75 or 25% canopy cover. Those were completed in 2008. And then we burned every 2 years from 2008 to 2016, either in the fall, the growing season, October before leaf abscission, or the dormant season, early March, before the trees were leafing out. So you can see that replicated out here. We've got 2 replicates at this particular site. We've got these plots where we measured all of this stuff within these replicates of pairings between fall or spring burning and woodland or savanna residual basal area. So thinning a little, thinning a lot. And then we also had controls. So we located these comparable 20-hectare oak dominated stands. We had 2 replicates of every treatment at Catoosa and Land Between the Lakes, and 1 at Green River Game Lands there in North Carolina. And then we did, for this particular study, we did not analyze the Daniel Boone National Forest data set. So here are the results of implementing those treatments. What I want you to pay attention to is basically that we've got this control line, the solid line. And so these lines will be the same throughout this talk. So do maybe pay attention to them now so that they'll make sense later. So doing nothing, near 100% canopy closure and very high basal area of trees. If we thinned a little and kept burning, we get this woodland treatment. So these gray lines, solid lines that are burned in the fall or the spring. So they're kind of tracking each other at these various sites. And then finally, our savanna treatments burned in the fall or the spring, and you can see where those kind of landed. So we've got that variability across which we can make some conclusions at these 3 sites. All right, so then we measured within each of these treatments the herbaceous response. And that involved doing these point intercept methods where we basically stretched a tape across the land. And then at every 1 meter interval, we looked down and acted like we were dropping a laser and documented all the hits that we had on all the vegetation. And so that would have been, all those hits were classified to species, but then also sorted as either grass, forb, and then from that, we could calculate an estimate of diversity from those measurements. And then we also, at each interval, classified non-herbaceous hits in terms of woody, litter, debris, or bare ground cover. We also took some measurements on slope position, and aspect, looked at that, analyzed it all with some fancy statistics, and looked for species level effects by basically just comparing treatments versus controls. And when in comparing that, looking at whether we had more, the same, or less encounters with species in treatments relative to controls, so that we could gain a little bit of sense at how species specific effects were working out. And we had 5 different hypotheses. Our first hypothesis was that herbaceous ground cover and diversity would be greatest in the treatment burned in the growing season and thinned the most. Our second hypothesis was that burn only would be the same as control, that we'd have to be able to thin and get light to the understory to have any effect at all. So that burning alone without doing anything to the overstory would be the comparable to doing nothing at all. Our third hypothesis was that thinning and burning, regardless of season and level, would be a greater response than control. We'd have greater herbaceous ground cover and diversity response in savannas than woodlands, and with fall fire relative to spring fire. So that sorts out all of the things in which we were hypothesizing within this experimental design. So our results. In terms of grasses, thin and burned was always greater than control at all sites. You can see that here. So our woodland treatments, our savanna treatments always ended up with a lot more grass than our controls. Savannas were only greater than woodlands at Catoosa, where we applied fire multiple times. So at every other site, we only had one burn that we got to investigate that was applied. And at Catoosa, we had 3 burns, so we did end up seeing this separation between savannas and woodlands, with savannas having greater grass cover than woodlands. And burn only and fire season, there was no effect. So there's no difference between the 2 fire seasons. There's no difference between burn only and controls, as we suspected across the study. To zoom into our pre to post richness in the number of species we observed. So the number on the left of each of these panels records the number of grass species recorded at the site prior to doing anything across all the treatments. And then the final number is what we've observed at the end. So we saw this, 9 species to 71 species occur at the Catoosa site, and similar increases at the other site. The most common response included Piptochedium evenseum, which is needlegrass, lots of sedges, dicantheliums or deer tongues grasses, Chanthamanthium and Danthonia. Also 5 species of native warm season grasses came in after the implementation of these treatments. And then in terms of invasive species, we had Microstygium and Miscanthus as our 2 species of invasive grasses. And so we had Microstygium was present at all sites and came in after a disturbance. And then Miscanthus was only present at Green River. So something to be a little bit concerned about. But only 2 of all of the species that we documented across the entire study were negatively affected by thinning and fire. Those 2 species listed there. And then also important to note that we had decreases with increasing slope and towards northeasterly aspects in terms of our grass cover. For wildflowers, thin and burn was again greater than control at all the sites. You can see that again in those images there. Savannas were greater than woodlands only at the Catoosa site. Again, the only place where we burned multiple times did we see that separation between savanna and woodland treatments. And then burn only and fire season had no effect on herbaceous metrics. So there was no difference between burn only and control, and no difference among the fire seasons. Similar numbers there for wildflowers. So before we did anything, we had 5 species of wildflowers. After thinning and 3 burns, we had 177 species of wildflowers at Catoosa. The only of all the species that were encountered prior to doing anything, only 4 of those species were encountered greater than 5 times. So basically this is like we found them on one plot in one instance in time. And so, even at like a site like Green River where we had, 67 different species encountered, those species became much more abundant as we move forward. So the most common was American burnweed, eupatoriums, solidago, so our goldenrods, as well as violets. We had 10 different species of violets. Legumes were very plentiful at Land Between the Lakes and made the wildflower response there a little bit unique in terms of its dominance by legumes. We had 1 species of invasive wildflower, that's a miniature beefsteak plant, which we encountered only twice at Catoosa. And then in terms of negative effects on wildflowers, only 7% or 19 of the 259 total Forb species dominated were negatively affected, in that they were more common in the controls than they were in the treatments over the duration of the study. And so these were largely forest associated species, but only 17% or only 7%, 19 species. And then we had no relationships between topographical variables. All right, so we've covered grass response, we've covered wildflower response. Now we're going to get at just the diversity of these communities. So this is a Shannon Weaver index. So basically this is balancing the robustness, so how much ground cover there was, with how it was distributed across the species. So a very diverse community would be lots of species with an equal distribution across those species. And so that's important to track. And again, thin and burn was greater than controls at all sites. Savannas were again greater than woodlands, but only at Catoosa. And burn only and the the burn only had a mixed result. And you can, see that in these, the burn only, these long dash, short dash, sometimes they're better than the control, sometimes they're not, like at Green River, or they are better at Land Between the Lakes. So kind of inconclusive there, but fire season always did not have an effect. So there was no difference. Those dark and light dots are tracking each other. It is really just that difference in canopy cover that's tracking or explaining the variation that we saw in response. So ultimately, when we zoom in at the final years after we've applied these treatments, we had a 21-fold increase in herbaceous diversity at Catoosa, a 3-fold increase at Green River, and a 7-fold at Land Between the Lakes, which I think is pretty impressive. So now we've got numbers for the entire herbaceous community. So we're going from 19 species of grasses and wildflowers all the way up to 258 at Catoosa, the site specifically. And then across all the species that we encountered, there was only negative effects on 6% of the species. So 23 out of 359 were negatively affected by thinning and burning. And these were largely forest associates. And then diversity decreased as you approached northeasterly aspects. So certainly these drier, more sun-facing southwesterly aspects are places where diversity was the greatest. All right, so then to relate these trends back to these other covers that we tracked, woody, litter, debris, and bare ground cover, the thing to point out here is that relative to controls, thinning and burning increased woody, debris, and bare while reducing litter ground cover. And that fire season had no effect. So basically we're just lumping in thinning and burning, and we're increasing the woody ground cover pretty substantially. And in fact, the only treatment to reduce woody ground cover was when we burned alone at Green River. So we didn't open the canopy, we didn't agitate all of that woody regeneration, and we also burned, and it was the only time where we actually saw a greater than 2-fold decrease in woody density. And that was the only time where you can see it. On every other treatment, we're increasing woody ground cover. In terms of litter, around a 45% decrease in our treatments relative to our controls. And the only other thing that was significant is there was this slight difference by about 15 to 20% in terms of savannas having less litter than woodlands. And I would also want to point out that there's this oscillating effect on bare ground and debris as we apply fire. So immediately after fire, we have a lot of bare ground and maybe more debris, and then we, that debris kind of dissipates, or the bare ground is swallowed up by vegetation that's moving in, and so we have these oscillating effects. All right, so to wrap all this up together, prior to treatment, we had less than 6% cover by herbaceous species, or by herbaceous vegetation, and around 118 species across all sites. After, and in the final year, we had close to 60%, so a dominance of herbaceous vegetation in the understory, and 359 species recorded. And only 6% of those species were negatively affected by thinning and burning. So relative to our hypotheses here. We did not see a fire season effect. So there is not, relative to our first hypothesis and our fifth hypothesis, there just wasn't a fire season effect. The positive effects of burn only were very rare. So that addresses our second hypothesis. Thin and burn was always greater than control, addressing the third. And savannas were always greater than woodlands after we repeated that fire. So a very important clarification there is that when we repeated fire, like at Catoosa, we did see that separation occur. And the other thing that I want to do here is just look at fold increases in terms of across the categories that we've looked at: ground cover of grasses, forbs, the richness, so just the number of species, as well as the diversity, so how equally distributed across those species those were. And on average, across all three sites, we had 14-fold increase in grass, 50-fold in wildflowers, 9-fold in herbaceous richness, and 10-fold in diversity. Now, if we pull out Catoosa, which is, again, to remind you, the one place where fires occurred repeatedly, those numbers go up in almost all cases, to the point where we get 123-fold increase in wildflowers, 14-fold in the number of species, and a 21-fold increase in herbaceous diversity. And if, before anyone jumps in and says, well, maybe these were all just kind of weedy species, I do want to make the point that most all of these wildflowers and grasses that were moving in were highly conservative and indicative of grasslands and woodlands, and they disappear quite rapidly as soon as those community types disappear. We're not talking about, roadside ruderal species. These are some really cool things like blazing stars and gentians and fringed orchids and grass of Parnassus and other orchids and a species of sundew, just some really cool plants that are largely declining everywhere else. So nearing the end here, what was really driving this response? So the underlying mechanisms seem to be reductions in germination inhibiting layers of leaf litter and coarse woody debris, which resulted in biennial increases in bare ground. And this really does point to the fact that we could probably have an even greater response than what we observed if we were able to better control understory woody competition. Because again, I want you to remind you of some really good work on the understories of these systems in that our diversity peaks at high fires per decade and the middle of the ground canopy cover. So what we have done is we've largely restored that overstory dynamic instantly by thinning. We've got to intermediate levels of canopy cover. However, our fires are young, and we've only applied 3 fires at even our most advanced site, and so we're still dealing with trying to weed our way through this robust understory of woody competition. And so that gradient doesn't really exist quite yet. We haven't quite hit our mark yet. So we have some room to improve relative to that as we keep applying fire. And really what this points to is that mesophication is dangerous in that now we have some very established mid-story stems that we're going to have to fight our way through. And it's going to take repetitions of fire to make sure that we deplete those root reserves completely and get to the point where we can actually elicit mortality and not just have this constant resprouting of all of that vegetation that we top kill with each fire. And I think that this idea is also supported by the fact that we had the positive effects of burn only were rare, that thin and burn was always greater than controls, and savannas were greater than woodlands after repeated fire, all pointing to this as a conclusion. So what are the management implications of all of this? And in wildland fire, we have something called doing mop up. And mopping up is when you basically are scrubbing the area for hot spots and making sure it's all out before you leave the area. And so we're going to be mopping up all of this here. So to achieve similar to better results as this incredible explosion of herbaceous diversity that we have seen, I would say that we need to, first, we worried about site selection, land history, seed banks, invasives, the landscape context, the presence of conservative species are all going to be clues that you've got the right site. There was very little influence of topography. However, we did have a very relatively flat site at Catoosa, our most advanced site, where swales did seem to be very important in increasing the amount of diversity. So I think that that's important to note, but also you're not limited to southwesterly aspects. We can certainly get a good herbaceous response pretty much anywhere, at least at our relatively flat Catoosa site. Only fire alone reduced woody ground cover. So maybe this does suggest that there's some advantages to be had with burning before thinning. So before we anger all of the woody regeneration ready to be released by that overstories to harvest, if we could start burning and try to set that back and then maybe release it, there could be something good things to be said about that strategy. So then you would thin to 7 or 14 meters squared per hectare, or 30 or 60 square feet per hectare for savannas and woodlands respectively, and start biennially burning. So this is about as often as you can burn to allow the fine fuels to recharge, but also as frequently as you can burn so that you can, really put a dent into that woody ground cover that's going to be responding. But we did have this persistent woody ground cover, and so that suggests that maybe some mechanical surrogates, some chainsawing or hand sawing and herbicides or other things like that could be really used to get us further along. Also note that there's a similar response across the fire seasons despite differences in intensity. So we measured the intensity of these fires and often had lower intensity during our fall burns relative to our spring burns. And so that suggests the utility of expanding your burn season. So you can burn at any time and get the same effect, even though most people avoid burning in the growing season because they just get these piddly little fires. There might be something phenologically going on with the woody plants that allows those lower intensity burns to be just as effective as burning in the dormant season when you get maybe a little bit more intensity in terms of fire behavior. So also, perhaps we were burning in October, and that might just be too late to get that that effect that we were looking at. And so maybe looking at August or September fires is a good thing. And I think, another thing I want to mention real quickly is that all of this work at Catoosa was about restoring oak woodlands and savannas. And this brings us to this paradox of how do we encourage robust and diverse herbaceous layers that are largely shade intolerant and highly flammable, but also the regeneration that's very important in sustaining overstory structure, which creates shade and is fire sensitive. So we call this the savanna paradox. But fortunately, here at Catoosa, even in sites that were burned 8 times since 2000, repeatedly, we had regeneration of woody trees, shortleaf pine, regenerating right up through that fire regime. And I think that's a really interesting thing to note. And so we measured a whole bunch of stuff. We measured response variables in terms of the vigor and stocking of that shortleaf pine and all of its characteristics, and the herbaceous cover in the surrounding community, and tried to understand where we were doing both. Where are we encouraging the herbaceous layer that we want, as well as that woody regeneration that we want? And I did a cool little analysis here, which is called a regression tree. And what I want to point out specifically, so the orange variables are all about the herbaceous community. So things like diversity, grass cover, forb cover, that kind of thing. And the gray bars are indicative of the regeneration that we want in terms of shortleaf pine. So if we have some shortleaf pine regeneration, we can eventually get to a shortleaf pine woodland and savanna that sustains itself, right? So what we see here is that this regression tree, which splits up all the variation across this multivariate world that we exist in has clearly identified an area where we are doing both. And the splits in this tree that explain where we are doing both highlight that when you reduce basal area to 3 meters per hectare of residual basal area or lower, which is about 11% canopy cover, a reduced mid-story relative to the average, so around 5,000 small sapling stems per hectare, which was lower than average. Do so on southwesterly aspects, and then within 70 meters of a mature shortleaf pine, you're getting both. You're getting regeneration as well as that, and I think that that's really cool. Whereas in terms of where the negligible response for both, so we're not getting the fire-tolerant woody regeneration that we need to sustain the overstory, as well as not getting anything in terms of herbaceous response, was occurring where basal area was greater than 11.3 meters squared per hectare, or in other words, canopy closure was greater than 68%. So that largely classifies the entire eastern United States and shows how important disturbance is to maintaining these herbaceous layers and the woody regeneration that maintains these fire-dependent communities. And just in terms of the context of what we're talking about today, there was this other group here where we were encouraging the herbaceous response, just not getting the woody response, which is probably just as fine if we're talking about just encouraging robust herbaceous understory layers. And that grouping was defined by greater than 30% canopy closure. So reducing it to that. And it was less aspect restricted. So as soon as you get above that 30%, you're not getting that regeneration to pair with it. So finally, that is all the results I have for the herbaceous response, but I did want to leave you with tidbits on all of the other things that I studied during my time there at the University of Tennessee. So we were able to look at the woody regeneration response. And so before, dominated by those fire sensitive species and maples and oaks were a smaller component of that. But after all of those treatments, we had a much more equal distribution in the regeneration. So we're being able to encourage species that are otherwise a small component of our forests. Looking at bird response on some really interesting things in terms of those trends across it. So basically the results that we got, we can summarize by a gradient on the x-axis from grassland to forest, with savannas and woodlands kind of being in the middle, right? And so when we look at our early successional species, the scrub shrub birds, things like prairie warblers, we saw this increase as we thinned and burned and transitioned things to more of a woodland, savanna to grassland environment. We had other species that were very consistent across it. And these included a lot of our upper canopy species like scarlet tanagers that would zero in on the trees that were left. And so certainly there was their habitat remaining, just maybe less of it, but they were still certainly present. So we had more of a flat line. And then there were other species like ovenbirds, which zero in on the characteristics of habitat that exists in the understories of closed canopy forests, and they were declining. So as we thinned and as we burned, they were the ones to decline. And all of this suggests that there's the sweet spot that we can hit with woodland and savanna management right here in the smack dab in the middle, where we can make all of those species happy. And I think that that's a really cool thing. But the other thing to recognize is that the species that declined included 3 species of the 41 species that we analyzed. These species here, including the ones that had either a flat line or the ones that increased as we went towards woodlands, savannas, and grasslands, included 38 of those 41 species. So certainly there exists justification to push things out further towards grasslands or savannas and recognize that these other 3 species have plenty of places to be happy in other parts of areas that are unmanaged. We also looked at nesting success for 2 different specific species, the red-headed woodpecker and prairie warbler, which are declining regionally across the eastern United States, and just nest success that was off the charts in these savannas. In terms of 99% daily nest survival for red-headed woodpeckers, 94% for prairie warblers. So a really good thing, not just their occupancy, but also they're doing well reproductively in these systems. And then also in terms of numbers. So that was just the probability of encountering them, was this first graph I presented. But if we look at their numbers, early successional species are increasing as the overstory decreases. And late successional species actually are peaking at this intermediate level. So again, suggesting that there's this happy medium that we can target to make all of the birds in this community happy, pretty happy. Also, we looked at the bat community, a very similar thing in terms of our large body, what I call the bomber jet bats of our community. So any bat that was very large was actually responding quite positively to this transition from forests down to woodlands or savannas because you're creating more foraging space. These are bats that kind of bumble around and can't really navigate all the clutter of a forest really well. So they were responding quite positively to these treatments, whereas our fighter jet bats really didn't care or maybe saw a slight increase because they are really good at navigating that clutter. So again, suggesting that there's some happy medium where we can make both of them happy or choose to preferentially give some habitat to these larger bodied bats that need those more open foraging spaces. And then finally, we did some fuel work, and basically what we found is that there is a net reduction in fine fuels. So we're consuming our smaller fuels, but we're adding a lot of large fuels. And so every treatment actually increased fuel loads. But we are seeing this gradual replacement of the fine fuels by the increase in herbaceous vegetation. So I think that this is a cautionary tale to some managers who like to throw out fuel reduction as a additional benefit of fire management. And oftentimes what we're actually doing is pushing these systems to be more flammable. And so they actually might have more fuel, but that fuel may be largely fine grasses and forbs that are, pretty flashy and don't reach the intensity levels of more larger class woody fuels would have. So to wrap all this up, we definitely saw positive response in the herbaceous community decades after fire exclusion. And so this demonstrates the resiliency of these communities and the seeds that are stored under what is currently now largely leaf litter communities. And so I think that this really zeroes in on these policies that prioritize high quality sites. So where we're going out and looking for these incredibly diverse herbaceous communities and then prioritizing them, that is overlooking the tremendous restoration potential that may exist in what is otherwise inconspicuous oak forest understories throughout the eastern United States. And I want to leave you with this final point. So here we are today with a mesophying oak forest. So we've got oaks that dominate the larger size classes, these bigger oaks, but everything that's coming up underneath it are these fire sensitive tree species. And paint a picture with and without this fire management or all the management that I've described to today. So without, mesophication will continue. And we will have healthy forests, but they will be dominated by fire-sensitive, drought-sensitive species that may not do better in a future where fires will be more common in the United States, in the eastern United States, and drought will become far more common. And that's going to lead to a highly degraded forest across our eastern United States. However, if we manage with fire now and get back to this herbaceous layers with tree species and regeneration that is also fire tolerant and try to get back to that system, as fires increase, we can maintain a healthy forest in that future of climatic change. And if you're going to sit there and say, oh, Andy, again, fire is not coming to the eastern United States, I would just simply point you to when I graduated from the University of Tennessee and 14 people died in wildfires that burned right through Gatlinburg. And I think that that is just a hint at what is to come for the eastern United States. So something that we should definitely be thinking about. So to sum all this up, mesophication in reverse. So transitioning from what is largely a dark, wet, closed canopy forest to something that I think is truly unique and spectacular. So with that, I know that I maybe ran over a little bit, but I would love to have any questions if there are out there. Yeah, just thank you so much for tuning in and listening to me jammer about my research here.
Thank you so much. What a incredibly comprehensive study. That's so informative in so many ways. I can totally see why your work is being studied and cited by many people. This is amazing. And I think a lot of what you talked about tonight is applicable to what we're trying to do here in the Pine Bush Preserve, because we found something similar when we started applying fire. We were finding that fire alone was not bringing back the ecosystem. So our work here is really targeted at bringing back this inland pitch pine scrub oak barrens. And because of the suppression of fire, we were finding that even the native species like scrub oak, that's in the name of the community, was overabundant, and we could not control it or thin it out or get it to open up enough for our more herbaceous and grassy layers to reestablish. So very applicable to what we have seen here. I have many questions. I have some questions coming in. I'm going to encourage everyone to go ahead and submit your questions either in the chat box or in the question answer. So I will start here. Richard asks, how far back do we have evidence of human use of fire in the Americas?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that's something that always comes up. And I think that some of the sentiments behind the question are, how much of this is human induced in terms of the history of fire in the Eastern United States, and how much of it is maybe more natural. And I guess the first thing that I would like to point out is that, for 10,000 years since the glaciers retreated, humans were pretty much coming in right as that happened. And so our oak forests and things like that experienced that anthropogenic fire. And there is evidence. So one of my sites, as I mentioned, was the Daniel Boone National Forest. There's some really cool areas there called Cliff Palace Pond, where they did some paleoecological studies where they were looking at markers of fire and then tracking it with activity in the Cliff Palace nearby. So Cliff Palace Pond, right beneath the Cliff Palaces. So they had these 1-to-1 ratios between Native American activity as well as the indicators of fire in the depositional cores of that pond. And what they saw is they tracked each other. And so all the way back in time. And so I think that, to recognize that humans have always placed a footprint, put their stamp on the land, and that has a lot to do with fire, is something that's important and something that we need to recognize when we talk about these things. But then I will also say that 10,000 years would not have been enough to lead to the evolutionary development of a lot of characteristics of either species or plants, communities, and plant species that appeared to be adaptations to fire. Now, it's really hard to prove those. They may be adaptations, right? So if we had large herbivores stumbling through forest and woodland type settings and repeatedly knocking down trees, we would get trees that would be really good at resprouting, right? So whether they evolved as relative to that or fire is pretty hard to parse out. But I will say that, I refer people back to the fact that fire has been influencing vegetation since the Silurian, since we completed the fire triangle, since we had enough oxygen and fuel and ignition points to lead to that. So there's always been this relationship regardless of human presence. And so the fact that our current oak systems are only 10,000 years old, sure, but they would have migrated north from where they were as a result of glaciation pushing everything kind of south. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's the Yeah, the pine bush is a very xeric habitat. And so I've heard that some of those, yeah, it's difficult to tease out if those adaptations have to do with fire or happen to also be help with fire, but maybe were originally for to deal with like drought situations or
Oh, for sure.
Well,
and in drought and fire are just connected, at the hip.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. One would lead to the other for sure. So
yes.
Danielle says, do you think this is a method that could be used to help reduce the severity of wildfires out west?
So the interesting thing, and I hinted at some of the work that I did in terms of our fuel dynamics across this experimental design. And what I kind of, in doing this investigation, led myself to is the fact that in the eastern United States, fuel accumulation and fuel decomposition rates exist about in equilibrium. So we don't have the same issues as the Western United States do, in that when our forests are fire suppressed, they develop in a way that leads to the negative effects of mesophication, but that does not necessarily lead to an abundance of fuel and more intense mega fires like we have out west. And that is because we have better, darker environments that lead to increases in fuel decomposition rates. And so that equalizes that effect. Now out west, you have much drier environments. So when forests are suppressed of fire, the fuels accumulate. And that leads to the megafires and the difference that you see there. And so I think to answer the question, absolutely, the restoration of more open, like I have a really good image I wish I had in this picture from a National Geographic episode way back where it's ponderosa pine environments and basically shows this, historical low frequency or high frequency, low intensity fires just kind of trickling in the grassy understory under these widely spaced ponderosa pines relative to today where we have all this influx of ladder fuels and just hugely, really thick duff layers of needles and just a lot more fuel. And that burns so intensely that it basically just wipes the community, sterilizes the soil. And this is for sure. So I think restoring woodland and savanna structure and getting back to more historical fire frequencies is absolutely something that could address the wildfire issues out west. But important to recognize the difference between eastern and western systems.
So this might be out of your wheelhouse, but I have heard this. Richard asks this, and I have heard this before too. One is about the concerns with CO2 emissions and how is fire contributing to that, and also whether or not different types of habitats, savanna versus woodlands, are better at sequestering carbon.
Yeah. So actually, I want to do something here. All right, so you can see just the PowerPoint itself. It's like the Microsoft version, right? You can see everything.
Yep.
Okay. So you'll remember this animation that I presented at the end, right? Of with or without management, the future of our eastern forests. So I want to refer people when they think about that carbon question, when we thin and when we burn, if the trees that we thin, we lock up in wood products, buildings and things that last for centuries. I think that is a good thing, and it's an argument for more wood. And I would point you to the Michigan State University's mass timber building that we are currently in constructing. So this is a multi-story, gigantic, building, basically skyscraper on our campus, our STEM building, that is being built completely out of mass timber. So laminated CLT,
Wow.
All wood. And I think that that's a really good thing in terms of this carbon equation, to take this wood, lock it up. into buildings that will be a carbon store for many, many years. And so I think that that's an important thing to think about, the thinning piece. Now, the fire certainly is a carbon emission, but I want you to compare the two scenarios that are depicted in this. If we don't burn now and we're not emitting carbon, or if we do burn now and we're emitting carbon that way, what are the long-term implications in terms of the carbon emission story? When we enter a future where it is likely to be warmer, I'm sorry, but we missed the boat. It's coming. And droughts are likely to be more frequent. And so when those fires and droughts combine to exact a negative toll on a forest that we are not currently managing, to have the species that are tolerant and resilient to the effects of those changes coming in the future, that carbon emission from all of those degraded and dying forests and all those fire sensitive species that are going to be standing dead out there just rotting away is, I think, a part of the story that is ignored, and something that could maybe possibly equalize that whole perspective, that story. And it's certainly an important part of the story. And then the other thing I'll just say is that there's a greater than 99% decline in this biodiversity, whether you talk about species, whether you talk about the communities themselves. And I think that to say carbon is something we should be concerned about, but there are plenty of other places and other forests that we can manage in terms of being good at sequestering and storing carbon. That perhaps this just isn't the communities that we do that in.
That makes sense. And then, oh, let me just make sure something else. Okay. So I had a question, actually, me and my coworker, Steve, had a question about all these forbs that you see coming up after this burn. And I mean, these are like rare things, like you said. So it didn't sound like you were doing any restoration planting. So are those all existing in the seed bank? Are they existing on the landscape to a small extent and they're expanding after the fire? What do you think is happening with those?
Yes. So we did not do any direct investigations to answer that question, other than that there was a complete lack of plantings. No, there was no plantings. This is all things that just have either or originated in the seed bank. They were coming up out of a seed bank that had been stored there. You have to understand that the sites that we selected were selected for a reason. They're selected on aspects or in areas where it is likely that oak woodlands and savannas and fire was frequent at one point in time. There were indicator species around there. So, if we would have done larger and more extensive surveys, we likely would have found most of those species, but we just would have had to cover a ton of ground and a lot of things, roadsides and that kind of thing. And I'll also add that likely it's mostly all from the seed bank, but there were evidence. So, in the first year after thinning the overstory, we would get sometimes 8 to 10 foot tall, big giant clumps of big blue stem and Indian grass and that kind of thing. That does not happen from seed. You would not, they just don't get that big in their first year of life. And so what that suggests is that you have this very old root system of a big blue stem plant that is just hanging on with a couple of sprigs or just a couple of stems that was much less obvious. And then as soon as the light was there, it took off and was able to respond in that way. And there's evidence of that with some other plants as well. So these are perennial, very old lived plants that could have existed in that way. And then in terms of how much of that was just kind of migrating, I think that, again, I would say it's largely from the soil seed bank and less so as just kind of wind dispersed. So I mentioned American burnweed as kind of being the #1 most frequently encountered forb. That is a very light seeded, and it was like exploded. And a lot of those plants, so our eupatoriums, our the American burnweed and that kind of thing were transitional. So those really light seeded and maybe less conservative species were blowing in, and they were like kind of dominating, but then they would give way to more conservative prairie species that would pop up. And so, yeah, dispersal it would be an interesting question, but I would argue that I think seed bank studies go to show largely that is capable of it. And
I was trying to find out. Oh, sorry. Is that burnweed? Is that also called pilewort? Does that have like a lot of common names?
Yes. Yep. I believe so. Etrichites hyracifolia.
Yeah. We have that too, I think.
Yeah. And I also want to mention real quick. So Dr. Beal was the old manager of the Arboretum, I think, here at Michigan State, and he's actually gotten some recent press. So he's long ago. He's long since passed away, very old. But when he was here, he buried a whole bunch of jars of seeds and would dig them up every, I think 1 year, and then he like moved to 5 years to basically see how many of them would germinate. They've continued his work after he's long gone, and they've increased it to 10 years, and then they increased it to 20 years. So they dig up one of his bottles every 20 years. Wow. And how many of all of these species of plants will germinate after that. And it's pretty incredible to see how long lasting these seeds, can remain dormant in the soil.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah. I don't know a lot about it, and maybe I shouldn't have even brought it up, but I think it's pretty incredible to see that.
Yeah. Steve also asked, were there any species that were historically present that were not, like, you didn't see come up? Was there anything you were thinking you'd see at these sites that you didn't after a fire?
I mean, sure. I think so. It's hard for me. So I will say, when you look at my work and you look at this publication and all the data that it represents, it was something that was tacked on. So the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency reacted to an outbreak of the southern pine beetle, and that killed an overstory that was largely shortleaf pine with scattered oaks. And so when they went in and salvage harvested all of the standing dead pine, they were left with a very scattered overstory of oaks. And what do we do with that? We've cut at levels like we've never cut before. Well, let's start burning it and see what happens. All of this herbaceous diversity just exploded onto the scene, and they were like, all right, well, we're restoring oak woodlands and savannas. That's what we'll call it. That was in 2000, and the study initiated in 2008. So there are areas of Catoosa that are much more advanced than what this data set represents, because we wanted to kind of start from where they started and document the whole process. But in those much more advanced areas, the diversity is even more incredible. It's just really, really cool to see. So in answering that question, it's hard for me to not consider those sites as well as part of this, and recognize that there are just a lot of state listed, rare species, coastal disjuncts, and just a lot of really cool things going on at Catoosa that my results don't quite encapsulate, but I don't know that there's something missing. But I am also not, I will profess to not being a botanist or somebody that's super in tune with those kinds of things. I think there's better resources there.
Well, that was one of my questions for you, was that, I mean, you probably couldn't describe it because you had all these 4 different sites, but I was kind of curious, like, those places, do they have management plans? Like, what kind of spurred them to start doing this fire management? Are they attempting to restore this type of ecosystem? It sounds like at this one site, they were taking advantage of what happened as a result of a southern pine beetle invasion.
For sure. And so to pair it with the other sites, Green River Game Lands, a much smaller scale. So at Catoosa, the total area that they are managing to oak woodlands and savannas with this type of management exceeds 5,000 acres. So it really is large scale, the largest oak woodland oak savanna east of the Mississippi, I would say, for sure. I've never heard of anyone say anything bigger. And at Land Between the Lakes, it's the U.S. Forest Service. I think they're just restricted by not really pulling the trigger and thinning to the levels that they needed to. One thing I didn't mention was that, the difference there, that they're, they, first of all, we're only targeting 40 square feet, even at their lowest thinnings, and they rarely hit that. So I think that's just kind of an aversion towards thinning to the level at which, these communities and that response kind of requires.
Gotcha. Mary says, are there forests where a closed canopy and leaf litter ground is desirable?
Forests where leaf litter and closed canopy are desirable. Yeah. Oh yeah. And I think, I hope that I don't come across as someone who's saying we need to do this across the landscape, because that's certainly not true. Like I said, there are, but I guess I just want people to recognize that closed canopy forests and leaf litter dominated understories are one point on a continual gradient from grassland to forest. And if you think about all of the species and how they line themselves across, we can talk about wildlife, we can talk about herbaceous plants, we can talk about trees, whatever we're talking about, they will line themselves up, stack themselves up along that gradient, that this is my range of happiness. This is where I exist. This is where I find the things that I need to thrive. And all of the work that I've done in terms of birds, bats, herbaceous response, tree regeneration suggests that indeed closed canopy, leaf litter dominated understory forests are a point along that gradient. And they are one point where with a small fraction of the total diversity of the Eastern United States associated with it. So whether we're talking about birds, there are 2 or 3 species that will be negatively impacted because that's what they like. We're talking about wildflowers. There are, a suite of species that are negatively impacted because that's what they want. And so we cannot eliminate all of it. However, we need to recognize we need to span the gradient.
Awesome. And then I know I'm keeping you late. There's just one more question from Scott and Denise. They say, is the area you studied similar to the oak openings part in the Toledo metro area?
Yeah, I would say similar. I would point out, I believe the oak openings would be glaciated. And I think that introduces a whole nother suite of variation that it would be interesting to work in. So my current work now with the Michigan State University, a lot of our research and study in forests occurs across this glaciated landscape where even without fire, you can go from outwash sites that are super xeric, have high rates of water infiltration. And water just, it rains on them and the water disappears immediately. It just goes through the sand. Relative to high fertility morainal sites that are very mesic, and that's just across the road from each other. So sites that are dominated by sugar maple and beech and basswood and black cherry, and then you go across the road and it's nothing but black oak and white oak and that kind of thing. So that would be an effect to add over top of this, just the site level differences. And in those outwash sites, you would have no problem regenerating oaks. And in fact, everything else dies. Oaks are the only thing that survives. And so there's things to be concerned or to think about there that do not exist further south.
Man, this is, I feel like I'm going to let you go. But just a fascinating topic. Not only, bringing into, how historically these ecosystems existed on the landscape with the help of fire, but also how that could help, how fire can actually help these ecosystems persist in the face of climate change is like kind of mind blowing. And it's amazing that you have this incredible work that tells us that. So thank you so much for a wonderful lecture. And I'm getting comments on the chat too. Everybody says applause. Thank you for very informative, well presented. So thank you so very much. And good luck with your work.
Thank you very much. And if anyone wants to email me, I know my email was up there, but vandery1@msu.edu. And feel free to reach out and can send you resources or whatever. But otherwise, thanks for tuning in and listening to the work. I'm glad it's making its rounds and getting to the people and the managers that need it. So.
For sure. Thanks very much.
Awesome. Thank you very much.